For over a century, archaeologists have been digging through the sands of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, searching for one of history's most famous stories. Armed with the latest technology, ground-penetrating radar, and decades of meticulous excavation, they've scoured every possible location mentioned in the Book of Exodus. They've mapped ancient trade routes, uncovered forgotten cities, and traced the footsteps of pharaohs. But there's one thing they haven't found: the evidence for the Exodus. Not a single pottery shard, not one campsite, not even a grave. And that's not just unusual, it's archaeologically impossible. Welcome to a historical rabbit hole that will challenge everything you thought you knew about one of the world's most foundational stories. I'm talking about the Exodus from Egypt, the dramatic tale of Moses leading millions of Hebrew slaves out of bondage through 40 years in the wilderness toward the Promised Land. It's a story that has shaped 3 major religions, inspired countless works of art, and forms the backbone of Jewish identity. But here's the problem. According to modern archaeology, it never happened. At least not the way the Bible tells it. Now, before you click away, thinking this is just another attack on religious faith, let me be clear about something. This isn't about destroying belief or undermining spirituality. This is about following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it takes us down uncomfortable paths. Because what archaeologists have discovered, or rather what they haven't discovered, tells a story that's actually more fascinating than the traditional narrative. It's a story about how legends are born, how history gets rewritten, and how sometimes the most powerful truths aren't found in what happened, but in what people believed happened. The scale of the problem becomes clear when you understand what the Bible is actually claiming. According to the Book of Exodus, approximately 600,000 Hebrew men, plus their wives and children, left Egypt in a single, coordinated departure. Do the math, and you're looking at somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. That's not just a migration. That's the equivalent of the entire population of Chicago suddenly picking up and walking into the desert for 40 years. Think about that for a moment. 2 to 3 million people wandering through the Sinai Peninsula for 4 decades. That's longer than World War II lasted, longer than most modern nations have existed. An entire generation born, raised, and died in the wilderness. If this happened, the archaeological evidence should be overwhelming. We should find pottery scattered across hundreds of square miles, cooking hearths, burial grounds containing tens of thousands of graves, tools, weapons, jewelry, religious artifacts, the detritus of daily life multiplied by millions of people and stretched across 40 years of nomadic existence. But here's what archaeologists have actually found in the Sinai during the proposed time frame of the Exodus. Virtually nothing. The region shows almost no signs of human habitation during the entire 2nd millennium BCE. Not just limited occupation, almost complete emptiness. Even Kadesh Barnea, where the Bible claims the Israelites camped for 38 years, was completely uninhabited until the early 12th century BCE, well after the traditional dating of the Exodus. This isn't a case of archaeologists not looking hard enough. The Sinai Peninsula has been surveyed more intensively than almost any comparable region on Earth. Teams from multiple countries have spent decades mapping every wadi, every oasis, every possible camping spot. They've used satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic site surveys. Modern archaeological techniques are so sophisticated that they can detect the remains of small nomadic groups that pass through an area for just a few months. The idea that a population the size of modern-day Chicago could live in the Sinai for 40 years and leave no trace is not just unlikely, it's impossible. The silence becomes even more deafening when you examine what the Bible claims happened in Egypt itself. According to Exodus, the Hebrews weren't just any slaves. They were the backbone of Egypt's construction industry, building the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramesses. The plagues that preceded their departure weren't minor inconveniences. They were catastrophic events that brought the Egyptian empire to its knees. Water turned to blood, crops destroyed, livestock killed, and finally, every firstborn son in Egypt struck dead in a single night. The economic and demographic impact would have been devastating. Yet Egyptian records, which are among the most detailed and extensive of any ancient civilization, contain not a single reference to these events. The Egyptians documented everything: military campaigns, trade expeditions, construction projects, foreign diplomatic relations, even natural disasters like famines and floods. They recorded defeats as well as victories, invasions as well as conquests. The Hyksos invasion and expulsion, for example, was thoroughly documented by Egyptian historians, even though it represented a humiliating period of foreign rule. But the departure of 2 to 3 million slaves, preceded by ecological disasters that supposedly crippled the kingdom. Complete silence. No administrative records noting the sudden shortage of workers. No military documents describing the pursuit of fleeing slaves. No economic texts lamenting the loss of Egypt's labor force. No religious inscriptions trying to explain why the gods had abandoned Egypt to such catastrophic plagues. The absence of a named pharaoh in the biblical account makes the investigation book historical even more complex. The of Exodus simply refers to Pharaoh, as if this were a name rather than a title. This anonymity has created centuries of speculation among scholars and believers trying to identify which specific Egyptian ruler was involved. Some point to Ramesses II, others to Thutmose III, still others to various pharaohs of the New Kingdom period. But the proliferation of theories only highlights the fundamental problem. There's no Egyptian evidence to support any of them. The archaeological silence extends beyond Egypt and the Sinai to the supposed destination of the Exodus, the land of Canaan. According to the Bible, the Israelites conquered Canaan in a series of dramatic military campaigns, destroying cities like Jericho and Ai in spectacular fashion. But archaeological excavations at these sites tell a different story. Jericho, the city whose walls supposedly came tumbling down at the sound of Joshua's trumpets, shows no evidence of destruction during the proposed time frame of the conquest. The city appears to have been largely uninhabited during the Late Bronze Age, when the biblical conquest was supposed to have occurred. The pattern repeats across the archaeological landscape of ancient Palestine. Sites that the Bible describes as major Canaanite strongholds show no evidence of sudden destruction or foreign conquest during the supposed period of Israelite invasion. Instead, the archaeological record reveals something far more gradual and complex: the slow emergence of a new culture in the central highlands of Canaan, beginning around the 12th century BCE. This is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because the archaeological evidence doesn't just tell us what didn't happen, it reveals what actually did. The earliest settlements that can be identified as distinctly Israelite don't show signs of foreign origin or Egyptian influence. Instead, they display clear cultural continuity with their Canaanite neighbors. The pottery styles, architectural techniques, and even religious artifacts suggest that the Israelites emerged from within Canaanite society rather than conquering it from outside. The archaeological signature is remarkably consistent across dozens of early Israelite sites. They similar pottery traditions share with other Canaanite settlements. They use the same basic architectural style, including the distinctive four-room house that became characteristic of Israelite domestic architecture. Their cult objects and religious symbols are associated with El, the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. Rather than showing distinctly Egyptian religious influences that you might expect from a people who had spent centuries in Egypt and experienced the dramatic divine interventions described in Exodus, perhapsingly, the one most tell clear cultural marker that distinguishes early Israelite sites from their Canaanite neighbors is an absence rather than a presence, the lack of pig bones in their refuse pits. While neighboring sites show evidence of pork consumption, Israelite settlements consistently avoid pig remains. This suggests a dietary restriction that would later become central to Jewish law, but it's hardly the kind of dramatic cultural discontinuity you'd expect from a foreign population with a completely different background and religious experience. The genetic and linguistic evidence supports this archaeological picture. Hebrew belongs to the Canaanite branch of the Semitic language family, sharing close relationships with other local languages like Phoenician and Moabite. If the Israelites had spent centuries in Egypt before arriving in Canaan, you might expect to find Egyptian loanwords or linguistic influences in early Hebrew, but these are largely absent. What emer is a picture of grages from the archaeological evidence duel ethnogenesis, the slow formation of Israelite identity from within existing Canaanite populations. Rather than the dramatic arrival of a foreign people described in the Bible, the evidence points to internal social and cultural changes within Canaan itself. Some scholars suggest this process may have been triggered by the collapse of Egyptian control over Canaan at the end of the Late Bronze Age, creating a power vacuum that allowed new social formations to emerge in the previously marginal highland regions. This archaeological revolution in our understanding of Israelite origins raises profound questions about the Exodus narrative itself. If the Israelites were indigenous to Canaan rather than Egyptian refugees, how did the story of slavery, liberation, and wilderness wandering become so central to their identity? When was this narrative created, and what purposes did it serve? The answers to these questions take us deep into the politics and theology of ancient Israel, revealing how the Exodus story may have been crafted centuries after the supposed events to serve specific religious and political needs. But that's where our investigation leads us next, into the shadowy world of ancient scribes, royal propagandists, and religious reformers who may have transformed scattered memories and folk traditions into one of history's most enduring narratives. The evidence gets even more troubling when you examine the specific chronological claims made in the biblical text. 1 Kings chapter 6 places the Exodus exactly 480 years before the construction of Solomon's temple, which would date the departure from Egypt to approximately 1450 BCE. This creates what scholars call the early date theory for the Exodus. But here's the problem. This number isn't historical, it's symbolic. 480 represents 12 generations of 40 years each, a pattern that appears throughout biblical literature as a way of organizing time into meaningful, divinely ordained periods. The symbolic nature of biblical chronology becomes clear when you compare it with actual Egyptian historical records from the proposed time frame. The 15th century BCE corresponds to the height of the Egyptian New Kingdom, when pharaohs like Thutmose III and Amenhotep II were at the peak of their power. Egyptian control over Canaan during this period wasn't theoretical, it was absolute. Archaeological evidence shows Egyptian administrative centers, military installations, and cultural influence throughout the region that the Israelites were supposedly conquering. Egyptian inscriptions from this era actually describe military campaigns into Canaan, bringing back prisoners and tribute from various Canaanite cities. The famous Karnak reliefs show Thutmose III's campaigns in detail, listing dozens of conquered cities in Palestine. The idea that a massive Israelite invasion force was simultaneously conquering these same territories, while Egyptian armies were campaigning there and Egyptian administrators were governing there, creates an impossible historical contradiction. The alternative late date theory, placing the Exodus around 1250 BCE during the reign of Rameses II, doesn't fare any better under archaeological scrutiny. This time frame has become popular largely because of Hollywood films and the discovery of a city called Pi Ramesses in the Nile Delta, which some identify with the biblical Rameses. But the archaeological evidence from this period shows continued Egyptian strength and control, not the kind of catastrophic collapse that the plagues narrative would suggest. Ramesses II ruled for 66 years, and left behind more monuments, inscriptions, and records than almost any other pharaoh in Egyptian history. His reign was marked by major construction projects, military campaigns, and diplomatic achievements, including the world's first recorded peace treaty with the Hittite Empire. The administrative records from his era are extensive, covering everything from worker rations to military logistics. Yet nowhere in this massive archive is there any mention of Hebrew slaves, devastating plagues, or the sudden loss of a significant population portion of the kingdom. The silence becomes even more mysterious when you consider that the Egyptians were actually quite candid about recording disasters and setbacks. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes medical procedures for treating battlefield injuries. The admonitions of Ipuwer lament social chaos and foreign invasion. The Cannibal Hymn frankly discusses periods of famine and civil war. Egyptian literature includes prophecies of doom, accounts of foreign conquest, and detailed descriptions of natural disasters. They weren't afraid to document catastrophe. They just apparently never experienced anything resembling the events described in Exodus. The absence of Egyptian records becomes particularly glaring when you compare it to other major population movements that the Egyptians did document. The expulsion of the Hyksos, a Semitic people who ruled northern Egypt for over a century during the Second Intermediate Period, was recorded in detail by multiple Egyptian sources. Manetho's account describes how the Hyksos were driven out and fled into the Levant, establishing fortified cities there. Some scholars have suggested that memories of the Hyksos expulsion might have contributed to the Exodus narrative, but the chronology doesn't match, and the scale is completely different. The Egyptians also documented smaller-scale movements of Semitic peoples in and out of Egypt. Administrative texts from the New Kingdom period describe groups of Asiatics working on construction projects, prisoners of war being settled in Egypt, and diplomatic exchanges involving the movement of people between Egypt and the Levant. These records show that the Egyptians were perfectly capable of tracking and documenting foreign populations within their borders. The complete absence of any record of a Hebrew slave population becomes even more significant in this context. Archaeological surveys of the Nile Delta, where the Bible places the Hebrew slaves, have uncovered extensive remains from the New Kingdom period, including worker villages, administrative centers, and construction sites. These excavations have revealed a complex picture of Egypt's labor force, including evidence of foreign workers from various parts of the ancient Near East. But none of these sites show evidence of the massive Hebrew population described in the biblical account. The city of Avaris, the former Hyksos capital that was later rebuilt as Pyramesses, has been excavated extensively over the past several decades. The site-ultral population reveals a multec including Egyptians, Nubians, and various Asiatic groups, but no distinctive Hebrew cultural markers. The pottery, architectural styles, and burial practices all reflect the broader cultural patterns of the ancient Near East, without the kind of unified cultural identity that you might expect from a people who had maintained their distinct traditions through centuries of slavery. Even more telling is what happens when archaeologists trace the proposed route of the Exodus through the Sinai Peninsula. The traditional route, following the ancient trade paths between Egypt and Canaan, was heavily monitored and controlled by Egyptian military installations. Papyrus Anastasi I describes the Egyptian border fortifications in detail, including guard posts, supply stations, and patrol routes, designed to monitor and control movement between Egypt and Asia. That, too, the idea to 3 million people could have passed through this heavily fortified frontier without leaving any trace in Egyptian military records, stretches credibility beyond the breaking point. The Egyptian army maintained detailed logs of border crossings, trade expeditions, and military movements. Diplomatic correspondence from places like Amarna includes reports on much smaller population movements and tribal migrations. Absence of any reference. The complete to a massive Hebrew exodus becomes impossible to explain if the events actually occurred as described. archaeological teams have surveyed not just the major routes through Sinai, but also alternative paths that the Israelites might have taken to avoid Egyptian detection. The results are consistently negative. Remote wadis that might have provided water and shelter show no signs of large passes that could scale occupation. Mountains have served as defensive positions, contain no evidence of campsites or fortifications. Even areas far from Egyptian control, where you might expect to find evidence of a people trying to avoid detection, remain archaeologically silent. The sophistication of modern archaeological techniques makes this silence even more significant. Satellite surveys can detect ancient roads and settlement patterns from space. Ground-penetrating radar can locate buried structures and refuse pits without excavation. Systematic surface surveys can identify pottery scatters and tool fragments that indicate human presence. Environmental archaeology can detect changes in vegetation and soil chemistry that result from human habitation. None of these techniques have produced evidence supporting the biblical account of the Exodus. The contrast with other ancient migrations is striking. Archaeological evidence for the Sea People's movements through the eastern Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age collapse is abundant, even though these were probably smaller populations moving over shorter time periods. The Celtic migrations into Asia Minor, the movement of Germanic tribes across Europe, and even the much later Arab expansion into North Africa, all left clear archaeological signatures. The complete absence of similar evidence for the Exodus migration is unprecedented for such a claimed large-scale population movement. This archaeological vacuum extends to the religious and cultural artifacts that should accompany such a dramatic religious experience. The Bible describes the Israelites carrying elaborate religious objects, including the Ark of the Covenant, golden vessels from the Egyptian temples, and the detailed ritual implements prescribed in Leviticus. These objects were supposedly central to Israelite religious practice throughout the wilderness period. Yet no trace of this distinctive religious culture appears in the archaeological record of the Sinai. The implications of this archaeological silence extend far beyond questions of historical accuracy. They force us to confront fundamental questions about how religious narratives develop, how collective memory works, and how communities create founding stories that serve their spiritual and political needs. The absence of archaeological evidence for the Exodus doesn't necessarily invalidate its religious or cultural significance, but it does require us to understand it in a completely different context than traditional interpretations have suggested. The evidence becomes even more damning when you examine the supposed timeline of Israelite settlement in Canaan itself. According to the biblical narrative, the conquest of the Promised Land was swift and decisive. Joshua's army swept through the region like a divine hurricane, toppling fortified cities and establishing Israelite control from Dan to Beersheba. The archaeological reality tells a radically different story, one that suggests the biblical authors were crafting a heroic origin myth centuries after the fact. Take the famous Battle of Jericho, perhaps the most iconic conquest story in the entire Bible. The walls came tumbling down at the sound of ram's horns. The city was utterly destroyed, and every living thing within was devoted to destruction. It's a story so vivid and dramatic that it's been retold countless times in Sunday school classrooms and Hollywood films. But when archaeologists actually excavated Jericho, they discovered something shocking. The city was essentially uninhabited during the Late Bronze Age, when the biblical conquest was supposed to have occurred. Kathleen Kenyon's extensive excavations at Tel es-Sultan, the ancient site of Jericho, revealed that the city had been destroyed and abandoned around 1550 BCE, more than a century before even the earliest proposed date for the Exodus. The site remained largely deserted until around 900 BCE, well into the Iron Age. There were no walls to come tumbling down, no thriving Canaanite city to conquer, no population to destroy. Joshua's army would have been attacking empty ruins. The pattern repeats across the archaeological landscape of ancient Palestine. The city of Ai, which the Bible describes as the second major conquest after Jericho, was also uninhabited during the proposed conquest period. The very name Ai means the ruin in Hebrew, suggesting that even the biblical authors knew they were dealing with an abandoned site. Yet the book of Joshua describes elaborate military strategies, ambushes, and the complete destruction of a thriving city that simply wasn't there. Gibeon, Lachish, Hazor, city after city mentioned in the conquest narratives shows the same archaeological pattern. Either they were uninhabited during the late Bronze Age, or they show no evidence of the kind of sudden, violent destruction that the biblical accounts describe. Some sites do show destruction layers from this period, but these appear to be the result of the broader late Bronze Age collapse that affected the entire Eastern Mediterranean, not specific Israelite conquests. What makes this archaeological silence even more mysterious is that we do have clear evidence of what actual ancient conquests looked like. When the Assyrians conquered cities in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, they left unmistakable archaeological signatures. Destruction layers filled with arrowheads and siege equipment, buildings burned and collapsed in ways consistent with military assault, and often inscriptional evidence boasting of their victories. The Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE is archaeologically visible across multiple sites, with clear evidence of burning, demolition, and abandonment. But the supposed Israelite conquest of Canaan? Archaeological silence. It's as if the most dramatic military campaign in biblical history happened in a parallel universe that left no physical trace in our world. The implications are staggering because they suggest that the entire narrative framework of Israelite origins, slavery in Egypt, liberation through divine intervention, conquest of the Promised Land, may be a theological construction rather than historical memory. The archaeological evidence points instead toward what scholars call a gradual emergence model of Israelite origins. Beginning around 1200 BCE, small agricultural settlements began appearing in the central hill country of Palestine, areas that had been sparsely populated during the late Bronze Age. These villages show a distinctive material culture that would later be identified as characteristically Israelite, but their origins appear to be local rather than foreign. The pottery from these early highland settlements doesn't show Egyptian influences that you might expect from a people recently escaped from Pharaoh's kingdom. Instead, it demonstrates clear continuity with late Bronze Age Canaanite ceramic traditions. The architectural styles, particularly the famous four-room house that became standard in Israelite domestic architecture, appear to develop from earlier Canaanite building techniques rather than representing a foreign tradition imported from Egypt. Even more telling is the religious material culture from these early sites. The cult objects, figurines, and religious symbols don't reflect the kind of strict monotheism that the Exodus narrative would suggest. Instead, they show clear connections to the broader Canaanite religious world, including objects associated with El, the chief deity of the Canaanite pantheon, and even figurines that may represent Asherah, El's consort in Canaanite mythology. This archaeological picture suggests something far more complex and gradual than the dramatic conquest described in Joshua. Rather than foreign invaders sweeping in from the desert, the evidence points to indigenous social and cultural changes within Canaan itself. Some scholars describe this as a process of internal nomadization, settled Canaanite populations moving into marginal highland areas and developing new forms of social organization that would eventually crystallize into Israelite identity. The trigger for this process may have been the collapse of Egyptian control over Canaan at the end of the late Bronze Age. For centuries, Egypt had maintained a network of administrative centers, military installations, and vassal relationships that kept the region under tight imperial control. But around 1200 BCE, this system collapsed as Egypt withdrew from its Asiatic territories to deal with internal problems and invasions by the mysterious Sea Peoples. The Egyptian withdrawal created a power vacuum in the Palestinian highlands. allowing new forms of social organization to emerge in areas that had previously been marginal. These highland communities developed distinctive cultural practices, including, apparently, dietary restrictions that led to the absence of pig bones in their archaeological deposits that would later become central to Israelite identity. But this process took centuries, not the few decades described in the biblical conquest narratives. The genetic evidence supports this archaeological picture of indigenous origins. Modern DNA studies of Middle Eastern populations suggest that Jews, Palestinians, and other Levantine peoples share common ancestry that traces back to the ancient populations of the region. While these studies can't definitively resolve questions about ancient population movements, they're consistent with the archaeological evidence for continuity between ancient Canaanites and early Israelites. Linguistic evidence tells a similar story. Hebrew belongs to the Canaanite branch of the Semitic language family, sharing close relationships with Phoenician, Moabite, and other languages spoken by Israel's neighbors. If the Israelites had spent centuries in Egypt before conquering Canaan, you might expect Hebrew to show Egyptian linguistic influences or to preserve archaic features that reflected its foreign origins. Instead, Hebrew appears to have developed within the normal evolution of Canaanite languages. The picture that emerges from this archaeological and linguistic evidence is radically different from the biblical narrative, but it's also more historically plausible. Instead of a dramatic exodus and conquest, we see the gradual emergence of Israelite identity through internal social processes within Canaan itself. This doesn't mean the Exodus narrative is worthless. It may preserve memories of smaller-scale movements, social conflicts, or religious developments, but it does mean we need to understand it as something other than straightforward historical reporting. This raises the obvious question: if the Exodus and conquest narratives don't reflect historical events, when and why were they created? The answer takes us deep into the politics of ancient Israel and Judah, revealing how these stories may have been crafted to serve specific religious and political agendas during critical periods in Israelite history. Many scholars now believe that the Exodus narrative reached its final form during the 7th century BCE, during the reign of King Josiah of Judah. This was a period of intense religious reform and political consolidation, when Josiah was attempting to centralize worship in Jerusalem and extend his control over territories that had once belonged to the northern kingdom of Israel. The Exodus story, with its themes of liberation from foreign oppression and divine promises of land ownership, would have provided powerful theological justification for Josiah's expansionist policies. The timing is significant because this was also when Judah was struggling against Egyptian attempts to reassert control over Palestine. The powerful anti-Egyptian themes in the Exodus narrative, Egypt as the house of bondage, Pharaoh as the archetypal oppressor, divine judgment against Egyptian gods, would have resonated strongly with a population facing renewed Egyptian imperialism. The story may have been crafted, at least in part, as anti-Egyptian propaganda designed to strengthen resistance to foreign domination. But the political uses of the Exodus narrative didn't end with Josiah's reforms. During the Babylonian exile, when the Judean elite found themselves once again in foreign captivity, the themes of liberation and return to the Promised Land took on new relevance. The experience of exile may have led to further development and elaboration of the Exodus tradition, as scribes and priests sought to understand their current suffering in light of their ancestral stories. The Persian period, when the exiles were permitted to return and rebuild Jerusalem, provided another context for emphasizing the Exodus themes. The returning exiles needed to justify their claims to land that had been occupied by others during their absence. The Exodus narrative, with its divine promises of land ownership and its themes of return after a period of foreign sojourn, provided exactly the kind of theological framework needed to support these territorial claims. This doesn't mean the Exodus narrative was invented from whole cloth during these later periods. It's more likely that earlier traditions, folk memories, and perhaps historical kernels were woven together and elaborated over time to create the unified narrative we find in the biblical text. Some scholars suggest that memories of the Hyksos expulsion from Egypt, which occurred around 1550 BCE, may have contributed to the tradition. The Hyksos were Semitic peoples who ruled northern Egypt for over a century before being driven out by native Egyptian dynasties. The Hyksos connection is intriguing because it involves a Semitic population leaving Egypt under duress, eventually settling in Canaan and facing continued conflict with Egyptian forces, elements that echo themes in the Exodus narrative. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, actually identified the Hyksos expulsion with the biblical Exodus, though the chronology doesn't match traditional biblical dating. Other scholars point to evidence of smaller-scale movements of Semitic peoples between Egypt and Canaan throughout the Late Bronze Age. Egyptian administrative texts mention groups of Asiatics working on construction projects, and diplomatic correspondence describes various population movements in the region. It's possible that memories of these smaller migrations were eventually magnified and theologized to create the grand narrative of national liberation that we find in Exodus. The process by which historical memories become transformed into religious narratives is well documented in other ancient cultures. The Mesopotamian flood narratives, which influenced the biblical story of Noah, appear to have grown from memories of actual flooding events in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. The Trojan War traditions preserved in Homer's epics seem to reflect real conflicts in the late Bronze Age Aegean, though heavily mythologized and elaborated over centuries of oral transmission. What makes the Exodus narrative particularly interesting is how successfully it has functioned as both religious literature and political ideology. Its themes of liberation from oppression, divine intervention on behalf of the oppressed, and the promise of a homeland have resonated across cultures and centuries. The story inspired enslaved Africans in America, Jewish immigrants to Palestine, and liberation theologians in Latin America. Its power lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its ability to give meaning to experiences of suffering and hope. But this very power raises ethical questions about how we approach biblical narratives in an age of archaeological investigation. Does archaeological evidence that challenges traditional accounts threaten the spiritual and cultural value of these stories? Or can we find ways to honor both scientific inquiry and religious tradition, recognizing that different kinds of truth serve different human needs? The archaeological challenge to us to the Exodus narrative forces grapple with fundamental questions about the relationship between history and faith, between scientific evidence and religious meaning. It's a conversation that extends far beyond academic archaeology into the heart of how modern societies understand their founding stories and the role of historical truth in religious life. These questions become even more complex when we consider the modern political implications of Exodus archaeology. In contemporary debates over land rights, historical claims, and cultural identity, the archaeological evidence is sometimes wielded as a weapon by various parties seeking to support their positions. But the relationship between ancient history and modern politics is far more complicated than simple proof texts can capture. The absence of archaeological evidence for the biblical Exodus doesn't resolve contemporary political disputes, just as its presence wouldn't necessarily validate particular territorial claims. Ancient history, even when well documented, rarely provides simple answers to modern political questions. The archaeological record is complex, ambiguous, and constantly evolving as new discoveries are made and new analytical techniques are developed. What the archaeological evidence does provide is a more nuanced understanding of how ancient communities developed, how religious traditions evolved, and how powerful narratives can serve multiple functions across different historical periods. The Exodus story may not be historical in the sense that modern readers expect, but it remains one of humanity's most enduring explorations of themes that continue to resonate. The struggle against oppression, the search for identity, the hope for redemption, and the complex relationship between divine promise and human responsibility. Understanding these stories in their archaeological and historical context doesn't diminish their power. It reveals the sophisticated ways that ancient communities use narrative to make sense of their world and to transmit values across generations. The creators of the Exodus narrative were not writing modern history textbooks. They were crafting theological literature that could speak to the deepest concerns of their communities across changing circumstances and historical periods. The archaeological silence surrounding the Exodus ultimately tells us as much about the power of storytelling as it does about ancient history. It reveals how communities can create narratives so compelling that they become more real than the events they purport to describe. In a sense, the absence of archaeological evidence for the Exodus makes the story even more remarkable, because it demonstrates the human capacity to create meaning through narrative that transcends the limitations of historical fact. But there's another layer to this mystery that makes the archaeological challenge even more intriguing. The absence of evidence isn't just limited to the Exodus itself. It extends to the entire narrative framework of early Israelite history as presented in the biblical text. The period of the Judges, the united monarchy under Saul, David and Solomon, even the early history of the divided kingdoms, all present archaeological challenges that force us to reconsider traditional chronologies and historical assumptions. This pattern of archaeological silence extends to some of the most celebrated figures in biblical history. Take King David, the giant slayer who supposedly built a vast empire stretching from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt. According to the biblical account, David conquered Jerusalem, defeated the Philistines, and established a kingdom so powerful that it demanded tribute from surrounding nations. His son Solomon allegedly built a temple so magnificent that it drew visitors from across the known world, including the legendary Queen of Sheba. But when archaeologists search for evidence of this golden age, they find something far more modest. The Jerusalem of the 10th century BCE wasn't the glorious capital described in the books of Samuel and Kings. It was a small hilltop settlement, barely more than a village by ancient Near Eastern standards. There's no evidence of the massive construction projects attributed to Solomon, no trace of the elaborate palace complex, no remains of the first temple that supposedly housed the Ark of the Covenant. The famous Solomonic stables at Megiddo, once pointed to as proof of biblical accounts, have been redated to the 9th century BCE and are now attributed to the northern kingdom of Israel, rather than Solomon's unified monarchy. The monumental gates that were supposed to demonstrate Solomon's architectural achievements show similar dating problems. Each new excavation season seems to push the evidence for a powerful, united monarchy further into the future, or reveal that it belonged to later, more historically verifiable periods. This doesn't mean David and Solomon never existed. There may indeed be historical kernels behind these traditions. The Tel Dan Stela, discovered in 1993, mentions the House of David, providing the first extra-biblical reference to the Davidic dynasty. But this inscription dates to the 9th century BCE, long after David's supposed reign, and it tells us nothing about the scope of his kingdom or the magnificence of his court. What emerges from the archaeological evidence is a picture far more humble than the biblical narrative suggests. The 10th century BCE in Palestine appears to have been a period of small chiefdoms and local kingdoms, not the grand empire described in scripture. The population was largely rural, literacy was limited, and the kind of administrative apparatus necessary to govern a large kingdom simply didn't exist. The archaeological challenges become even more problematic when you examine the broader historical context of the ancient Near East during this period. The traditional biblical chronology places the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and the establishment of the monarchy during what historians call the 8th century BCE Late Bronze Age collapse, one of the most turbulent periods in ancient history. Around 1200 BCE, the entire Eastern Mediterranean world experienced a catastrophic series of events that brought down empires, destroyed cities, and disrupted trade networks that had existed for centuries. The Hittite Empire collapsed. Mycenaean Greece fell into darkness. Ugarit was destroyed and never rebuilt, and even mighty Egypt barely survived the onslaught of the mysterious sea peoples. This was not a time when a new kingdom could emerge and immediately dominate the region. It was a time of survival, fragmentation, and gradual recovery. Yet the biblical narrative places the Israelite conquest of Canaan precisely during this period of chaos and collapse. The chronological coincidence is suspicious because it suggests that the biblical authors may have been writing their story against the backdrop of what they knew had been a period of great upheaval, using historical memories of the late Bronze Age collapse to provide a plausible context for their theological narrative. The problem becomes even more acute when you realize that the collapse wasn't limited to political and military structures. It also involved massive cultural and technological disruption. The art of writing nearly disappeared in some regions. Complex Bronze Age technologies were lost. International trade networks that had connected the ancient world for centuries simply vanished. This was not the kind of environment in which detailed historical records could be maintained and transmitted across generations. This brings us to one of the most fundamental challenges facing the biblical narrative: the question of when these stories were actually written down. Traditional Jewish and Christian belief holds that Moses wrote the Torah, including the account of his own death, sometime around the 13th century BCE. But modern biblical scholarship has revealed something far more complex, a process of composition, editing, and revision that stretched across many centuries. The documentary hypothesis, developed by 19th century German scholars and refined by generations of biblical critics, identifies multiple sources within the Torah that reflect different time periods, theological perspectives, and historical circumstances. The earliest of these sources may date to the 9th or 8th centuries BCE, while the latest may have been composed during or after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. This means that the Exodus narrative, as we have it today, was written hundreds of years after the events it purports to describe, by authors who had no direct historical knowledge of the late Bronze Age world they were writing about. They were working with folk traditions, earlier written sources, and their own theological and political agendas to create a narrative that would serve the needs of their contemporary communities. The implications are staggering. Imagine trying to write a detailed historical account of the American Civil War using only oral traditions passed down through 6 or 7 generations, with no contemporary documents, no photographs, no newspaper accounts, and no official records. Then add to this challenge the fact that you're not really trying to write objective history. You're crafting a story that will inspire your community, justify their territorial claims, and strengthen their religious identity. This is essentially what the biblical authors were doing when they composed the Exodus narrative. They were creating what scholars call sacred history, a blend of historical memory, folk tradition, theological reflection, and political propaganda designed to serve specific communal needs. The question isn't whether they were good historians by modern standards. They weren't trying to be. The question is what purposes their narrative was meant to serve. One of the most revealing aspects of this process is how the biblical narrative handles Egyptian chronology. The authors of Exodus clearly knew some things about Egypt. They mention specific cities, describe Egyptian customs, and include details that reflect genuine knowledge of Egyptian culture. But they also make errors that reveal the limitations of their historical knowledge. The failure to name the Pharaoh of the Exodus is particularly telling, because Egyptian kings were known by name throughout the ancient Near East. Diplomatic correspondence, trade records, and military inscriptions regularly mention specific pharaohs by name. The biblical authors' refusal or inability to name this supposedly crucial figure suggests they were working with traditions that had become disconnected from their original historical context. Even more problematic is the biblical use of the title Pharaoh itself. While this word ultimately derives from ancient Egyptian, meaning great house, it didn't become a standard royal title until relatively late in Egyptian history. During the New Kingdom period, when the Exodus is traditionally dated, Egyptian kings were more commonly referred to by their personal names or by titles like Lord of the Two Lands or Son of Ra. The consistent use of Pharaoh as a royal title throughout the biblical narrative suggests that the authors were writing from the perspective of a much later period, when this usage had become standard. It's a small detail, but it's exactly the kind of anachronism that reveals the gap between when events supposedly occurred and when they were actually written down. These chronological problems extend beyond individual details to the entire structure of the biblical narrative. The Exodus story is filled with elements that make perfect sense in the context of later Jewish history, but seem out of place in the late Bronze Age setting where they're supposedly located. The emphasis on centralized worship, for example, reflects the religious reforms of the 7th century BCE rather than the religious practices of earlier periods. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Israelite religion was far more diverse and decentralized than the biblical narrative implies, with multiple sanctuaries, local variations in ritual practice, and even the worship of female deities alongside the male God of Israel. The detailed legal codes attributed to Moses show similar anachronisms. Many of the laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy address social and economic conditions that didn't exist in the Bronze Age, but were very relevant to the Persian and Hellenistic periods, when much of the biblical text was being edited and compiled. Even the geography of the Exodus narrative shows signs of later composition. The route described in the biblical text includes place names and geographical references that reflect the political and cultural landscape of the Iron Age rather than the Bronze Age. Some of the cities mentioned didn't exist during the traditional Exodus period, while others are described in ways that reflect later historical knowledge. This doesn't mean the biblical authors were deliberately falsifying history. They were working within different literary and historiographical conventions than modern historians. Ancient Near Eastern literature regularly projected contemporary concerns back into legendary pasts, using ancestral figures to address current problems and validate present institutions. What makes the Exodus narrative particularly sophisticated is how skillfully it weaves together multiple themes and concerns that were relevant to different periods of Israelite and Jewish history. The story of liberation from slavery spoke to communities experiencing foreign domination. The promise of land ownership provided theological justification for territorial claims. The emphasis on religious law offered a framework for maintaining cultural identity in diaspora communities. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of the Exodus narrative is how it transforms the experience of marginality into a source of divine election. Instead of being ashamed of their small numbers and peripheral status, the Israelites are told that they were chosen precisely because they were the fewest of all peoples. Instead of viewing their history of displacement and exile as evidence of divine disfavor, they're encouraged to see it as part of a larger divine plan. This theological innovation had profound implications for how Jewish communities understood themselves and their relationship to the larger world. The Exodus narrative provided a framework for maintaining hope and identity, even in the face of political powerlessness and cultural marginalization. It suggested that apparent weakness could be a sign of divine favor, and that justice would ultimately triumph over oppression. The power of this message explains why the Exodus narrative became so central to Jewish identity, and why it has continued to inspire liberation movements throughout history. But it also helps explain why the story developed the way it did, as a theological and political statement rather than a straightforward historical account. Understanding the Exodus narrative in this way doesn't diminish its significance. It reveals the sophistication of its authors and the complexity of the communities that preserved and transmitted it. These weren't simple people telling simple stories. They were skilled writers and theologians working within rich literary traditions to address the deepest questions of human existence. Why do the righteous suffer? How can small communities maintain their identity in the face of powerful empires? What does it mean to be chosen by God? The archaeological silence surrounding the Exodus ultimately points us toward these larger questions about the nature of religious literature and its relationship to historical truth. The absence of material evidence doesn't invalidate the spiritual and cultural insights of the biblical narrative, but it does require us to read these texts with greater sophistication and historical awareness. This perspective also helps explain why the Exodus narrative has proven so adaptable across different historical periods and cultural contexts. Because it wasn't tied to specific historical events that could be verified or falsified, it could be reinterpreted and reapplied as circumstances changed. Enslaved Africans in America could see themselves in the Hebrew slaves of Egypt. Jewish immigrants to Palestine could identify with the Israelites entering the Promised Land. Liberation theologians in Latin America could find inspiration in Moses confronting Pharaoh. But this same adaptability raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between religious truth and historical accuracy. If the Exodus narrative is primarily theological literature rather than historical reporting, what does that mean for communities that have built their identity around its historical claims? How do we honor both the insights of archaeological science and the spiritual needs of religious communities? These questions become even more complex when we consider the modern political implications of Exodus archaeology. In contemporary debates over land rights, cultural identity, and historical memory, the archaeological evidence is sometimes used to support or challenge various political positions. But the relationship between ancient history and modern politics is far more complicated than simple appeals to archaeological authority can resolve. The absence of archaeological evidence for the biblical Exodus doesn't automatically invalidate modern claims to cultural or territorial rights, just as the presence of such evidence wouldn't necessarily validate them. Ancient history, even when well documented, rarely provides simple answers to contemporary political questions. The archaeological record is complex, constantly evolving, and open to multiple interpretations. What the archaeological evidence does provide is a more nuanced understanding of how ancient communities developed and how powerful narratives can serve multiple functions across different historical periods. It reveals the sophisticated ways that human societies use storytelling to create meaning, transmit values, and maintain identity in the face of changing circumstances. The creators of the Exodus narrative were not writing modern history textbooks. They were crafting literature that could speak to the deepest concerns of their communities across generations and changing political. The power circumstances of their achievement lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its ability to transform experiences of suffering and marginalization into sources of hope and meaning. This brings us to perhaps the most important insight emerging from the archaeological challenge to the Exodus narrative: the recognition that different kinds of truth serve different human needs. Scientific truth, based on empirical evidence and logical analysis, helps us understand the material world and the processes that shape it. But religious truth, expressed through narrative, symbol, and ritual, addresses questions of meaning, value, and purpose that lie beyond the reach of archaeological excavation. The archaeological silence surrounding the Exodus doesn't resolve the tension between these different ways of knowing, but it does help us understand why both remain necessary. Human beings need both the rigorous investigation of evidence that archaeology provides and the transformative power of narrative that religious literature offers. The challenge is learning to honor both without forcing one to serve the purposes of the other. In the end, the archaeological investigation of the Exodus reveals as much about our own assumptions and expectations as it does about ancient history. It forces us to confront the complex relationship between faith and evidence, between individual belief and scholarly consensus, between the stories that inspire us and the data that inform us. The conversation continues, and perhaps that ongoing dialogue is more valuable than any definitive answer could be. The rabbit hole of Exodus archaeology ultimately leads us not to simple conclusions, but to deeper questions about the nature of truth, the power of narrative, and the complex ways that human communities create meaning from the raw materials of history and imagination, the absence of evidence becomes, paradoxically, a presence, a space where different ways of understanding the world meet, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes in tension, but always in conversation. The archaeological challenges don't stop at the missing millions in the Sinai or the phantom pharaoh in the palace. They extend to what might be the most shocking revelation of all. The entire foundation of ancient Israelite identity appears to be built on a historical inversion. When we peel back the layers of archaeological evidence, we discover that the relationship between Egypt and Canaan during the proposed Exodus period was exactly the opposite of what the Bible describes. While the biblical narrative presents the Israelites as oppressed slaves breaking free from Egyptian bondage to conquer their promised homeland, the archaeological record reveals a stunning reversal. During the Late Bronze Age, the very period when the Exodus supposedly occurred, Egypt wasn't losing control over Hebrew slaves. Egypt was the imperial power controlling Canaan. The Egyptians weren't the ones being abandoned by their workforce. They were the colonial masters governing the land that would later become Israel. This isn't speculation or theoretical reconstruction. We have extensive archaeological evidence of Egyptian administrative centers throughout Palestine during the 15th through 12th centuries BCE. Egyptian fortresses dotted the landscape. Egyptian officials collected taxes from Canaanite city-states. Egyptian scribes kept detailed records of tribute payments, military campaigns, and population movements. The famous Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and Canaanite rulers, paint a picture of tight imperial control over every aspect of Palestinian life. So when we imagine Joshua's armies sweeping through Canaan, conquering city after city in the name of Yahweh, we need to remember that those same cities were under direct Egyptian administration. Egyptian garrisons would have been stationed throughout the region. Egyptian bureaucrats would have been managing the local economies. Egyptian soldiers would have been patrolling the very routes that the Israelite armies supposedly used for their lightning conquest. The logistical impossibility becomes even more apparent when you realize that Egypt's control over Canaan wasn't theoretical or distant. It was immediate and overwhelming. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom didn't just claim authority over Palestine. They actively governed it through a complex network of vassal relationships, military installations, and administrative hierarchies. Local Canaanite rulers were essentially middle management in the Egyptian imperial system. This creates what historians call a chronological impossibility. How do you conquer a land that's already controlled by the empire you supposedly just escaped from? How do you establish a new kingdom in territories that are garrisoned by your former oppressors? The biblical narrative would require us to believe that Egyptian armies were simultaneously pursuing fleeing Hebrew slaves through the Sinai while also defending Canaanite cities against Hebrew conquerors in Palestine. The contradiction becomes even starker when you examine the specific cities mentioned in the conquest narratives. Jericho, Ai, Gibeon, Lachish. These weren't independent Canaanite strongholds ripe for conquest. They were part of the Egyptian administrative system. Attacking them would have been Tant itself, amount to declaring war on Egypt, not just on local Canaanite populations. But here's where the archaeological evidence takes an even more fascinating turn. The very cultural markers that we use to identify early Israelite settlements don't show Egyptian influence at all. They show profound continuity with Canaanite traditions. It's as if the people who would become Israelites never left Canaan in the first place, because they didn't. The pottery styles from early Israelite villages are evolutionary developments from late Bronze Age Canaanite ceramics. There are no sudden breaks, no foreign influences, no Egyptian technological signatures that you might expect from a population recently returned from centuries of bondage in the Nile Delta. Instead, we see gradual changes that suggest internal cultural development within existing Canaanite communities. The architectural evidence tells the same story. The famous four-room house that became characteristic of Israelite domestic architecture doesn't appear suddenly as a foreign innovation. It develops organically from earlier Canaanite building traditions, adapting local construction techniques to the specific environmental and social conditions of the Palestinian highlands. Even more revealing is the religious material culture from these early sites. The cult objects, religious symbols, and ritual installations don't reflect the kind of strict monotheism that the Exodus narrative would suggest. Instead, they show clear connections to the broader Canaanite religious world. Figurines associated with El, the chief deity of the Canaanite pantheon, appear regularly in Israelite contexts. There are even religious objects that may represent Asherah, El's consort in Canaanite mythology. This archaeological picture paints a scenario that's radically different from the biblical account, but far more historically plausible. Instead of foreign conquerors arriving from Egypt, we see indigenous social transformation within Canaan itself. The people who would become Israelites appear to have emerged from existing Canaanite populations through a process of internal cultural and religious development. The trigger for this transformation may have been the collapse of Egyptian control over Canaan at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Around 1200 BCE, Egypt began withdrawing from its Asiatic territories as the kingdom faced internal problems and invasions by the mysterious Sea Peoples. This Egyptian retreat created a power vacuum in the Palestinian highlands, allowing new forms of social organization to emerge in areas that had previously been marginal. These highland communities developed distinctive cultural practices that would later become central to Israelite identity. The absence of pig bones in their archaeological deposits suggests dietary restrictions that would evolve into the kosher laws. Their settlement patterns reflect a more egalitarian social organization than the hierarchical city-state systems of the Late Bronze Age. Their religious practices began emphasizing the worship of a single deity, though this monotheistic revolution wouldn't be complete for several more centuries. But perhaps the most significant development was the creation of a shared identity that transcended traditional tribal and territorial boundaries. These highland communities began to see themselves as part of a larger people with a common history and destiny. And that's where the Exodus narrative enters the picture, not as historical memory, but as identity-creating literature. The genius of the biblical authors was their ability to transform the experience of marginality into a source of divine election. Instead of being ashamed of their peripheral status as highland villagers living on the edges of more sophisticated urban civilizations, the emerging Israelites were told that they had been chosen by God precisely because they were humble and oppressed. Their lack of monumental architecture wasn't a sign of cultural backwardness. It was evidence of their rejection of the oppressive systems that built pyramids on the backs of slaves. The Exodus narrative provided a powerful explanation for why the Israelites were different from their neighbors. They weren't just another Canaanite ethnic group that happened to live in the hills. They were the descendants of people divine who had experienced liberation from the greatest empire on earth. Their distinctive practices, monotheism, dietary laws, social equality, weren't random cultural innovations. They were direct results of their unique historical experience with God's saving power. This theological framework had profound implications for how Israelite communities understood their relationship to the larger world. It provided a way maintaining cultural identity and religious commitment, even when they were politically powerless. It suggested that apparent weakness could be a sign of divine favor, and that justice would ultimately triumph over oppression. The narrative also served crucial political functions during different periods of Israelite and Jewish history. During the 7th century BCE, when King Josiah was attempting to extend his control over territories that had once belonged to the northern kingdom of Israel, the Exodus story provided theological justification for these territorial claims. The land wasn't just politically convenient, it was divinely promised. During the Babylonian exile, when the Judean elite found themselves once again in captivity, the themes foreign of liberation and return took on new relevance. The experience of exile led to further development of the Exodus tradition, as scribes and priests sought to understand their current suffering in light of their ancestral stories. The Persian period provided another context for emphasizing Exodus themes. When the exiles were permitted to return and rebuild Jerusalem, they needed to justify their claims to land that had been occupied by others during their absence. The Exodus narrative, with its divine promises of land ownership and its themes of return after foreign sojourn, provided exactly the theological framework needed to support these territorial claims. But the political uses of the Exodus narrative extended beyond questions of land ownership to fundamental issues of social organization and religious authority. The story established Moses not just as a historical figure, but as the archetypal prophet and lawgiver. The detailed legal codes attributed to him in Leviticus and Deuteronomy weren't just ancient customs, they were divine commandments received directly from God on Mount Sinai. This Mosaic authority became crucial for later religious reforms and legal innovations. When priests and scribes wanted to introduce new religious practices or modify existing ones, they could attribute these changes to previously unknown Mosaic traditions. The Exodus narrative provided an unassailable source of religious authority that could be invoked to support whatever changes the religious leadership deemed necessary. The process by which historical memories become transformed into religious narratives is well documented in other ancient cultures' narrats. The Mesopotamites, which influenced the biblical story of Noah, appear to have grown from memories of actual flooding events in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. The Trojan War traditions preserved in Homer's epics reflect real conflicts in the late Bronze Age Aegean, though heavily mythologized over centuries of oral transmission. What makes the Exodus narrative particularly sophisticated is how successfully it weaves together multiple layers of meaning and multiple historical periods. The story works simultaneously as liberation theology, political propaganda, legal justification, and identity-creating myth. It addresses the needs of different communities across different historical circumstances while maintaining a coherent narrative structure. The archaeological silence surrounding the Exodus ultimately reveals the power of this narrative strategy. Because the story wasn't tied to specific historical events that could be verified or falsified, it could be reinterpreted and reapplied as circumstances changed. The absence of material evidence paradoxically strengthened the narrative's theological power by preventing it from being reduced to mere historical curiosity. This flexibility helps explain why the Exodus narrative has proven so adaptable across different cultural contexts and historical periods. Enslaved Africans in America could identify with Hebrew bondage in Egypt. Jewish immigrants to Palestine could see themselves as latter-day Israelites entering the Promised Land. Liberation theologians in Latin America could find inspiration in Moses confronting Pharaoh's oppression. The story's power lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its ability to transform experiences of suffering and marginalization into sources of hope and meaning. It provides a framework for understanding injustice, not as evidence of divine abandonment, but as the context for divine intervention. It suggests that the arc of history bends toward justice, even when that justice takes generations to unfold. But this same adaptability raises profound questions about the relationship between religious truth and historical evidence. If the Exodus narrative functions primarily as theological literature rather than historical reporting, what does that mean for communities that have built their identity around its historical claims? How do we honor both the insights of archaeological science and the spiritual needs of religious communities? These questions become even more complex when we consider the modern implications of Exodus archaeology. The absence of historical evidence doesn't automatically invalidate contemporary cultural or political claims, just as the presence of such evidence wouldn't necessarily validate them. Ancient history, even when well documented, rarely provides simple answers to modern disputes over land rights, cultural identity, or religious authority. What the archaeological evidence does provide is a more nuanced understanding of how powerful narratives develop and function within human communities. It reveals the sophisticated ways that ancient societies used storytelling to create meaning, transmit values, and maintain identity across changing political circumstances. The creators of the Exodus narrative weren't trying to write objective history in the modern sense. They were crafting sacred literature that could speak to the deepest concerns of their communities across generations. Their achievement lies not in historical accuracy, but in creating a story so powerful that it continues to inspire and challenge readers more than 2 millennia after its composition. This recognition doesn't diminish the significance of the Exodus narrative. It reveals the remarkable sophistication of its authors and the complex needs of the communities that preserved and transmitted it. These weren't simple people telling simple stories. They were skilled theologians and political theorists working within rich literary traditions to address fundamental questions about justice, identity, and the meaning of history itself. The archaeological challenge to the Exodus narrative ultimately forces us to grapple with deeper questions about the nature of truth and the purposes of religious literature. It reveals the tension between different ways of understanding the past and different methods of creating meaning from historical experience. In many ways, the absence of archaeological evidence for the biblical Exodus makes the story even more remarkable. It demonstrates the human capacity to create narratives so compelling that they become more influential than the events they purport to describe. The power of the story lies not in what happened, but in what people believed happened, and how those beliefs shaped their understanding of themselves and their relationship to the divine. The ongoing conversation between archaeology and biblical studies reflects broader tensions in modern culture between scientific and religious ways of knowing. These tensions aren't easily resolved, nor should they be. The dialogue between evidence and faith, between historical investigation and religious meaning, continues to generate insights that neither approach could achieve alone. The rabbit hole of Exodus archaeology doesn't lead to simple conclusions, but to deeper appreciation for the complexity of human storytelling and the multiple functions that foundational narratives serve within religious communities. The silence of the archaeological record becomes paradoxically a powerful testament to the enduring influence of stories that transcend the limitations of historical fact. What emerges from this investigation isn't the destruction of a cherished narrative, but a more sophisticated understanding of how human communities create meaning from the raw materials of history, memory, and imagination. The Exodus story remains one of humanity's most powerful explorations of themes that continue to resonate. Liberation from oppression, the search for identity, the hope for justice, and the complex relationship between divine promise and human responsibility. The archaeological evidence doesn't resolve these eternal questions, but it does provide a richer context for understanding how they've been addressed across different historical periods and cultural circumstances. In the end, both archaeological investigation and religious narrative serve essential human needs. One helping us understand what happened, the other helping us understand what it means. The conversation continues, and perhaps that ongoing dialogue between different ways of knowing is more valuable than any final answer could be. The mystery of the missing Exodus becomes a window into the deeper mystery of how human beings create meaning, maintain hope, and find purpose in the face of historical complexity and uncertainty. The rabbit hole gets deeper when you realize we're not just dealing with missing evidence. We're confronting a complete inversion of historical reality. Because while archaeologists were searching for traces of Hebrew slaves fleeing Egypt, they discovered something that turns the entire biblical narrative on its head. The relationship between Egypt and Canaan during the proposed Exodus period wasn't just different from what the Bible describes. It was the exact opposite. Picture this. According to the biblical timeline, Joshua's armies are supposedly sweeping through Canaan around 1400 to 1200 BCE, conquering city after city in the name of Yahweh. But here's what archaeologists actually found from that exact same period. Egyptian administrative centers scattered throughout Palestine, Egyptian fortresses controlling strategic locations, Egyptian officials collecting taxes from local Canaanite rulers, Egyptian scribes keeping meticulous records of tribute payments and population movements. The famous Amarna letters, discovered in the late 19th century, paint a vivid picture of this reality. These clay tablets contain diplomatic correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and Canaanite city-state rulers, revealing a relationship of complete imperial domination. Local kings are essentially middle managers in the Egyptian bureaucratic system, constantly writing to Pharaoh asking for military support against rebellions, reporting on tribute collections, and begging for favorable treatment. So when we imagine the dramatic conquest of Canaan described in the book of Joshua, we need to understand what that would have actually meant in historical terms. Those Canaanite cities weren't independent strongholds waiting to be conquered. They were Egyptian administrative centers. Attacking Jericho wouldn't have meant fighting Canaanite defenders. It would have meant declaring war on Egyptian garrisons. The conquest of Ai wouldn't have been a victory over local tribes. It would have been an assault on Egyptian colonial infrastructure. The logistical impossibility becomes staggering when you realize the scale of Egyptian control. This wasn't distant, theoretical authority. It was immediate, overwhelming presence. Egyptian soldiers patrolled the very routes that Israelite armies supposedly used for their lightning campaign. Egyptian bureaucrats managed the local economies that would have supplied any invading force. Egyptian intelligence networks monitored population movements throughout the region. But here's where the archaeological evidence takes its most shocking turn. When researchers finally identified early Israelite settlements in the Palestinian highlands dating to around 1200 BCE, they made a discovery that nobody expected. These villages showed no Egyptian influence whatsoever. None. Not in their pottery styles, not in their architectural techniques, not in their agricultural practices, not even in their religious artifacts. Instead, what they found was profound cultural continuity with their Canaanite neighbors. The ceramic traditions evolved directly from late Bronze Age Canaanite pottery. The architectural styles, particularly the distinctive four-room house that became characteristic of Israelite domestic life, developed organically from earlier Canaanite building techniques. Even the religious material culture, cult objects, ritual installations, symbolic artifacts, showed clear connections to the broader Canaanite religious world. So here we are, at the bottom of one of history's deepest rabbit holes. We started looking for archaeological evidence of one of the world's most famous stories, and what we found instead was silence. Not just the absence of evidence, but the presence of a completely different reality. The Exodus, as described in the Bible, 2 to 3 million people wandering the Sinai for 40 years, the 10 plagues devastating Egypt, the conquest of Canaan, didn't happen. The archaeological record doesn't just fail to support this narrative, it actively contradicts it. The Sinai was virtually empty during the proposed time frame. Egyptian records, which document everything else, contain no trace of Hebrew slaves or catastrophic plagues. The cities supposedly conquered by Joshua were either uninhabited ruins or Egyptian administrative centers. But perhaps most shocking of all is what we discovered about Israelite origins. The people who became Israel weren't Egyptian refugees at all. They were indigenous Canaanites who gradually developed their own distinct identity in the Palestinian highlands. Their pottery, their architecture, their religious practices, even their DNA tells the same story. Cultural continuity, not foreign invasion. The Exodus narrative, as we have it today, was likely crafted centuries later by skilled theologians and political writers who transformed scattered memories, folk traditions, and maybe small historical kernels into one of humanity's most powerful stories about liberation, identity, and divine promise. It's not history in the modern sense. It's sacred literature designed to address the deepest questions of human existence. And maybe that's the most important discovery of all. The absence of archaeological evidence doesn't diminish the power of the Exodus story. It reveals something even more remarkable about human creativity and the need for meaning. Sometimes the most influential truths aren't found in what actually happened, but in what people believed happened and how those beliefs shaped their understanding of justice, hope, and identity. The conversation between archaeology and faith continues, and perhaps that ongoing dialogue is more valuable than any final answer could ever be. Because in the end, both scientific investigation and religious narrative serve essential human needs. One helping us understand what was, the other helping us understand what it all means.